Good evening. Thank you very much for coming. This is a privilege to receive in these 2 weeks Sue and David, Professor David Lyon, who is um, starting today to present a very interesting program. And I would like to thank you very much for coming to Ribeirão Preto. It's the first time in Ribeirão Preto, but it has been many times
A number of times.
in Brazil. And I would like to thank you, Paola, very much for organizing this. It was really hard work. Thank you very much. I ask you to uh, tell us something about the work of Professor David Lyon.
Welcome all. Welcome Professor David Lyon. Welcome Sue also. Professor is very well known for the studies about surveillance. And this course, the name is Surveillance, Technology and Society, and is an initiative of the new center here, CEADIN, Center for Advanced Studies in Law and Innovation. So Professor will speak about 25-30 minutes, then we'll have a break to questions about, you have some doubts and question him, about 15 minutes, and then more 35-40 minutes talk, another kind of talk for him, and then more 15 minutes. So he's internationally recognized for his studies in the field of surveillance. Would need no further introduction, but I will say some words about his view. He's the principal investigator of the Big Data Surveillance Project between 2015-2021. He's Professor Emeritus in the Department of Sociology and Law at Queen's University and is the former director of the Surveillance Studies Center. He has a lot of books, a lot of articles. I send a resume, an abstract for you know. Also, we are recording and we are also provide this for you after we edit it in the website of our new center. So the floor is yours, Professor. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you so much for the welcome to Brazil again, and for the kind hospitality of this university. Peço desculpa por não falar português. Por favor, diga-me se não entenderem a minha palestra. I'm going to make some introductory remarks about how I approach the study of surveillance and how I define the concept of surveillance. And so those remarks I'm going to make first, and then we'll come to more substantial section in the second part. So that's my plan. So we know that surveillance is an everyday experience. Surveillance is everywhere and always on. And of course, historically, we could not have said that. This is something that is new, and new in different ways in the 21st century. Cameras watch you on the highway. Whoa. So this thing doesn't seem to be moving it along. So much for the clicker. Okay. Cameras watch you on the highway, in the shopping mall, and on the bus. More personally, your phone allows companies to track you. That's it, thank you. In the shopping mall, and as you move from one environment to another. In many workplaces, your employer knows exactly what you are doing and how well you are performing at any given moment. Others know how well you are in health terms. During the COVID-19 pandemic, globally, many countries enhanced their public health, their data systems, in order to track and to try to slow the rates of infection. And conducted appropriately with adequate testing, treatment, and care, such surveillance can save lives. But many other kinds of surveillance also expanded hugely during the same pandemic, so that shopping from home, education at home, working from home, all these things led to an explosion of surveillance activities in a domestic space that people simply had not experienced previously. So it led to many more intrusive and sometimes even coercive kinds of surveillance becoming a domestic reality for millions of people around the world. So, as I say, surveillance is part of everyday experience. And surveillance today depends on many kinds of data, not least from social media. Such data are used for consumer advertising and for many other purposes. Many police departments also take advantage of personal data from open source of social media to check what's happening at key moments or sites, whether crime hotspots or airports, seaports, train stations, and so on. And at the same time, of course, social media platforms allow us to watch each other, and health and fitness apps allow us to watch ourselves. So we end up doing surveillance as well. Surprisingly, perhaps, considering how completely surveillance has enveloped our lives in the 21st century, few people know very much about surveillance, except in a vague way. Do we, for instance, have any idea where those data go when they leave our phones and our laptops? How we might benefit from that? Who has access to it? Who wishes to use it? For what purpose? We might be pleased to know that the big stores know our preferences and make special efforts to inform us when targeted offers are available. We might worry about privacy or identity theft, but who knows what tangible harms might occur as a result of our data being used, misused, or abused by companies or government departments. Surveillance today depends on many kinds of data. Such data are used for consumer advertising and also by public health and security agencies. See if I can make this thing work now. Ooh, no. I can't make it work. Oh, there we go. It's slow. Okay, well, this is how a little book that a student showed me one day. I had never heard of surveillance, a graphic guide, but she showed it to me and she said, "Did you realize that you appear in this book?" I said, "No, I had no idea." So this is how I was portrayed in the book. And as you can see, I'm making comments about just this, where those data go and how consumer data, that is data collected from so many, by so many companies, and including, of course, the internet companies, how they get used by public health or police, by other government bureaucracies, and so on and so forth. So those data really are very important. Anyway, you can learn everything from one page of this book, and it tells you all you need to know. There aren't many pages on me, only 4 pages on me. So many police departments in many countries take advantage of personal data from what they call open source. of social media to check what's happening, as I say. So let me just say a little bit about how I have tried to understand surveillance over many years, several decades, in fact. In 1978, I had finished my PhD 2 years earlier in 1976. In 1978, something happened in the world of computing. The silicon chip was invented. And right from when this silicon chip was invented, I mean, it was just a very, it was a miniaturizing of circuits, and it was printable right onto a silicon wafer thin material. And so the possibility for miniaturizing computers suddenly became a reality. And people believed that the world was going to be made in the image of silicon chips. This was going to be the new thing. And as a sociologist, I was rather skeptical about the dreams of where the silicon chip could take us. And so I started thinking as a sociologist and analyzing what was going on, trying to take a critical view of the dreams of a new silicon utopia. And I wrote articles and books about this. And one chapter in the first book that I wrote became very important to me. I looked at different dimensions of so-called information society, and then when I started thinking about data being used by governments and corporations, I thought, this is the area that sociologists have not spent a lot of time looking at. And so I thought I should check into this area. And so, we're already jumped to the next slide, that's fine. So I started writing another book, which came out of the chapter 5 of the earlier book, and that became The Electronic Eye, which is also in Portuguese, and it came out in 1994, and that was where I made some basic statements about surveillance, and I showed how surveillance was affecting different areas of life. Because until that time, most people thought of surveillance in terms of security or policing or workplace monitoring, things like that. And I tried to show that the area of consumption, of corporate use of data was going to become hugely important. And that was something that I thought was being neglected by other analysts. And in fact, I was basing some of my work on work that had been done by another sociologist, James Rule, back in the early 1970s. He wrote a great book about the credit card. In the early 1970s, credit cards were a very new idea. And you know, I know you all use them routinely now, but they were once new, and they were significant for data gathering. And of course, today they are hugely significant for data gathering. Anyway, I went on working on these kinds of things, and I kept meeting new scholars that I hadn't met before, learning from them, building research projects, and really enjoying the research and enjoying people that I met through those research projects. That's how, as you heard in the introduction, we ended up with something first called a surveillance, what did we call it? Surveillance project. And then the university wanted us to make it a surveillance studies center. And so that's what happened. And we enjoyed company of many people around the world who came to our center, including colleagues from Brazil, which has made life very exciting for many years in my particular little academic world. So I did work on identification cards, for example, for a few years. I once co-authored a book on liquid surveillance. So that's thinking of surveillance that moves so easily from one area to another. The liquefying of social institutions that allows, and the data, of course, helps to allow such liquidity. And one that I really, one of my books that I really like is called The Culture of Surveillance. And that book, as I'll try to explain this evening and during this, both of the 2 weeks, we are so much more involved within the surveillance world in the 21st century. And this again is something that is it's a novel dimension of surveillance, that our participation makes a difference. And also, we'll come to it, it can also make a political difference if we are involved in the surveillance. And the last book is not even out yet. This is a book for 2024, Surveillance, a very short introduction. So, taking you from the first book that I made about surveillance to the newest one that I made. So, let me try to define surveillance as I think about it. Let me see if I'm safe with this. Yes, I am. Didn't even do anything. What is surveillance then? Well, for one thing, the concept is vital for anyone living in a digital world, especially considering that the term surveillance is several hundred years old. Surveillance as a word started to be used in 1802. So it had quite a long history, but as I'm going to try to show this evening, it has a far longer history than the word that is used for it. The word that is used for it in a long-term view is very new. This word surveillance has been changed. Its meaning has changed over the years to fit new circumstances. And today, when surveillance has become part of the very infrastructure of contemporary societies, the task of understanding and updating the concept of surveillance is more important than ever. I have a little article in a journal called Internet Policy Review. It came out in 2022, and it was my latest attempt to try to define surveillance and describe the different ways that it is used. Internet Policy Review is freely available online, so anybody can read it. It's a multidisciplinary concept, for one thing. It isn't restricted to any particular discipline. And interestingly, of course, you can have people who are concerned about surveillance in law and business and computing and neurosciences and public health. And there are so many areas. So it's a very multidisciplinary concept used across many different disciplines. The ubiquitous use of smartphones, people being expected to use smartphones in daily life, has become a key surveillance enabling device. The data analyzing capacities of large corporations, organizations, public and private, means the concept has an ongoing life and impact. It's an analytical concept. It's used for analysis, but it is also a contested and critical concept. It's required for understanding and engaging with our times. Now, the concept of surveillance, a definition that I used in the 1990s is that it is the focused, systematic, and routine attention to personal details for the purposes of influence, management, protection, or direction, and you can add to that list, of course. So I wanted to say that it's focused. It has to have some specific focus, some kind of data. It has to be systematic. It has to be something that goes on from day to day. It's not just an occasional thing. It is not a glance. If you think of it in visual terms, it's not a glance so much as a gaze. It's got to be systematic, and it's routine. It's something that occurs over and over again. It is a routine event that continues all the time. And the purpose is, well, of course, social media influence, industrial relations, and organization behavior, those kinds of things, management, protection. You could think of police or security agencies or border controls, or direction. Surveillance might also be to direct you in a particular way in life or in purchasing or in working or whatever. So more recently, I have, as I said a moment ago, more recently I have adapted the definition a little bit, the definition that I use, to include the operation and experience. You remember a moment ago I talked about the ways in which we become participants in surveillance? Well, there's the experience of the collection, analysis, and use of personal data to shape choices or administer groups and populations. So I think the definition has to change along with the changing circumstances. And I discussed that in that little article that, as I say, is freely available online. I use words like routine attention to personal details, because we have to acknowledge that although surveillance, the French word, sur, over, veillance, watching, it is not the only way in which surveillance operates. It's not only a visual matter. And so that's why I use the word routine attention to personal details, because it can be audio, it could be listening, it can be so many other, there's so many other methods of doing surveillance. And of course, today, increasingly, the majority are data-based, and that is critical. And mention of the electronic means hints that even something simple like watching over, say, a worker by her employer is today much more subtle. So I like to think of surveillance not only in that positive sense of something that is deliberately done, but it is also a process whereby things and people and processes are made visible. So surveillance is not necessarily just something to which attention is paid. It's a way of making visible lives of people, processes in organizations, and so on and so forth. So I think it's helpful to think of it making visible or raising into awareness of certain kinds of activities or words or processes or whatever it is we're looking at. And today that making visible, as I say, occurs through data collection, analysis, interpretation, and action. Once upon a time, it was the collection of data that was the really important thing. Today, it's the analysis of those data that become critically important. And then the interpretation of that analysis. And then what is done with the analysis. So we're a long way from merely observing something. We have to look at the analysis and the interpretation and the action that comes out of the initial surveillance act, as it were. And the making visible can occur without any deliberate operator attention to or awareness on the part of particular people. Personal profiles may be discovered from all kinds of different data, gleaned from consumer behavior and from a myriad other sources. I'll give you one example. Then last time I didn't even touch it and it changed. There we go. Now you don't have this organization in Brazil, but I can tell you I have found Tim Hortons in Qatar in the Middle East. I found Tim Hortons in Australia, in the southern hemisphere where we are now. Tim Hortons is a coffee company. Anyway, there is a citizen of Ottawa, capital of Canada, in who wrote an article in a newspaper. And the article described something that he discovered. Because in order to obtain his coffee and his and his bagel in this case, he wanted to be able to order it in advance so that on the way to work he could pick up his coffee and bagel. And so he had the mobile ordering app installed on his phone. I'm sure you do the same thing. Anyway, he became suspicious of what he was being checked up on about. And he decided that he would make a Freedom of Information request. So he filled out the forms to make a Freedom of Information request. And a few months later, he had the reply from the company that runs Tim Hortons. It's not even called Tim Hortons, the company that runs it. And he found some interesting things. That it wasn't just when he was going to pick up his bagel and coffee that they knew about. It wasn't just what time he would be picking up the bagel and coffee. It was all sorts of things. It knew his girlfriend's address. It knew when he went to a baseball game in Toronto. It knew when he went to his cousin's wedding in Manitoba, like 2,000 kilometers from Ottawa. And it also knew where he had been on vacation. And it knew that he went through Schiphol Airport in Amsterdam on the way to Morocco, because his vacation was in Morocco. And it also knew that he passed by a competitor of Tim Hortons, a different coffee store, when he was in Marrakesh, in Morocco. It knew many more things than just what time he wanted to pick up, what kind of bagel and what sort of coffee on his way to work in the morning. Now, he found it important enough to him to do the Freedom of Information request and then to write about it in the newspaper. From my point of view, it was very interesting to read where it had followed him and what it was that it had found out about him. But this is happening all the time to all of us, and no one is excluded. If you're using a phone, this is what the phone company, or not necessarily the phone company, but the person who is running the app or whatever it is that you use, this is what they know. And James McLeod he thought it was very intrusive, and he thought that it was none of their business to know what his girlfriend's address was, or what he was doing at his cousin's wedding, or why he was near a Burger King outlet in Marrakesh. He felt annoyed about this. And he was only thinking about himself and his experiences. Myself, I think he's making a huge mistake in only thinking in very individual terms. because the surveillance that we're looking at is very much a social process with social repercussions, with social consequences. It is far more than, oh, my coffee company knows where I go on vacation. It is so much more. So in terms of understanding the surveillance, I could understand his disappointment or disgust or whatever it was at discovering what the company knew about him. But to stop there was to stop before he had really started to understand surveillance. I should write to him and tell him what I think, but I never have written to him yet. So what I'm saying is that the everyday experience of surveillance is very important. Remember, I said surveillance is the operation and experience of the collection, analysis, and use of personal data to shape choices and administer groups and populations. The experience of being surveilled may well be very positive. How many people check how many likes they have on their social media platform? We become very interested. And don't imagine that it's just you that likes the likes. You know, there are several academic social media platforms as well. And professors are encouraged to discover how many times their work has been liked by other professors or by students. And they will give you statistics about how often you are liked by these people in this country or whatever. So it isn't just something that happens for people with phones who drink coffee. Platforms are for everything and everyone. And so, you know, as a professor, it's very hard not to be sucked into those platforms, just like anybody else might be sucked into something that Meta gives you or X gives you or whatever it is. So you're not alone. We have to deal with that stuff too as professors. And while we might enjoy the likes, it also may raise negative aspects and negative emotions if you discover that the surveillance that is happening in relation to you or the group of people that you associate with, other students or whatever it is felt to be intrusive, like James McLeod found his Tim's Horton app, or for some kind of enforced conformity to some way of being. I mean, even as a professor, I could think, well, if so many people like that article, maybe I should continue and do more analysis on that area. I could switch into something different because of popular demand from other professors and students. You see how easily we could be manipulated, even in that simplistic way, by these systems that are designed to capture our attention and then manipulate what they have discovered through our attention into something that is intended to push us further in one direction or another. Okay. Now I've made some initial comments, so it's time for me to make a check on things. One, and probably most important, do you understand my attempt to speak English at the pace that is okay for you? Good. Well, that's a relief for a start. I'm very pleased to hear it. I'm very nervous about speaking with a group of people that don't share my language as a native language. So I am very grateful for that and for your patience in listening to me. And yeah, do you have some questions about the things that I've been saying so far? I've made a few comments about my own journey and how I got into thinking about surveillance issues. And that was one thing. And I also wanted to explain what I think of as some of the important ways in which we should study and think about surveillance. And I said a little bit about definitions and how they change over time and why that is important for us to think about. So that's what I've been trying to say so far. I have, I want to continue after we've taken a bit of a question and answer break. So if you have some questions or comments, and if those comments are complaints or something that you want to say critically, I'm very happy to hear your critical comments because I want to know, I want to learn, and I'm happy to hear whatever it is that you have to say, even though it might not make me happy. So, any questions so far? Feel free to ask.
Want to start because I have also.
You have a question.
Yes.
And I wasn't looking at you when I said that. Well, do you want to ask the first
no,
question?
but I
then?
want the students to start.
I don't believe you. Oh, there we go. Yep. Hi. So I didn't quite hear the question. How much is analyzed by? Yeah. Okay. Mm-hmm. So you're asking about how much is volunteered by the person and how much is simply, yeah, and how much is simply extracted, as it were, without the knowledge of. It's a really good question. And of course, I can't give you a kind of factual answer. All I can say is that the vast majority of those data are simply extracted. They, we give ourselves away in some instances, but really the huge emphasis is on the extraction of data, because it's, if we put it in a personal way, what is known about you is not gleaned only from you at all. It isn't simply extracted from your experience or your conversations or your presence in one place or another or whatever. It is gleaned through a process of combining and yeah. So it's gleaned from many sources and put together. And from that putting together of all that data, the purpose for which the agency that is using the data puts it together in a particular way will be this, that, or the other purpose. But the data is gathered from many people. And social media platforms were doing this before other kinds of companies, which is that your identity, as it were, is developed from many other people's data. So you are known, as it were, by the company you keep, the kinds of people that you know, that you associate with, that you see as friends on a meta platform. There's so many ways in which you become made up, or rather your online identity is made up from many, many different people and different organizations. So, you know, when Facebook invented the concept of friend, I should be careful, shouldn't I? The concept of friend that Facebook has is not the concept of friend that I work with in my ordinary life. I believe that friends are people who know me and I know them, and I have a good relationship with them because I trust them. You hearing what I'm saying? This is what I think is a friend. A Facebook friend can be anyone. And it may be somebody that you don't know, or that you know and you wouldn't necessarily trust. You know, there are so many ways in which the notion of friend, invented by Mark Zuckerberg and his friends, his associates, his colleagues, whatever, that concept, from an entrepreneurial point of view, was a gold mine for Mark Zuckerberg and his colleagues. But it was a completely new and different way of understanding friend from what I just said about my friends, the people that I love as my friends. Do you see what I'm saying? And so that concatenation of data that makes up what Mark Zuckerberg thinks you are has only a little bit to do with data that you have actually either volunteered or had taken from you. Does that make sense? Okay. Sorry it's such a disturbing answer, but such is life. Yeah, other questions or comments? I need to have somebody to wave at me to tell me to stop answering, because I tend to go on too long answering questions. I'll try to be more brief next time. Other questions, comments? You have one.
Yes. I'd like to ask you to say more about the word experience.
Oh, yes.
Which is in your new definition of, you know,
Yeah.
because it's really meaningful, but it's vague. So I think that I'm not a sociologist, okay, but I think that as a sociologist, you should explain us
Sure.
what do you exactly mean, especially considering that this is a definition.
Yep. That's a very good question, and a good observation too. And I was meaning it to be as general as possible and not to define the experience very closely, because the experience that we have of the collection, analysis, and use of personal data is so varied. I mean, it can come from so many sources. It could be the subway train that you ride in Sao Paulo. It could be the data from there. It could be data that comes from your much broader travels, if it's travel related. But you have to, when I say the experience, we all discover one way or another how our data are being used. We won't discover all the ways, but sometimes, like James McLeod in Ottawa, sometimes we do discover, and then our experience becomes fuller and more, well, in his case, he became he was appalled by the ways, by his experience of that surveillance. But it can be any other kind of experience. It could be a very positive experience, so that you you know, you order things from Amazon, and you think that Amazon has an increasingly good sense of what it is that you like to buy, because they're telling you so far in advance of your even realizing that you like that thing. And so that's another aspect of the experience. It's an enjoyable consumer experience, and you think that Amazon really is getting a good sense of who you are. So that's another way the experience can be positive for the user or the person involved. So all I'm saying is that one way or another, we become more aware of how surveillance is being carried out on us. And as we become more aware, our experience of surveillance, our conscious recognition that surveillance is happening to us, is part of the experience. It doesn't matter whether it's positive or negative, it's still part of the experience. And so in earlier times, we would be much less aware of surveillance being carried out on us, especially if the surveillance was deliberately hidden or shielded, or the purpose was shielded from us, so we couldn't know what was going on. But today we're just more and more aware of many kinds of surveillance, starting with social media companies, but going right through to, yeah, all kinds of surveillance. That's the sort of thing that I'm meaning. We can talk about it again later, but that's where I'm going with that. I think it's true to say that we are much more, we're experiencing surveillance much more than we used to. And by experience, I mean becoming aware of it and responding in one way. Yeah. Anyway, we can pick it up again later. Other questions? Yeah.
Which I would like to say has been really a joy and very intriguing. But like your answer about Amazon, many platforms such as Amazon or YouTube or especially online shops and give you suggestions about which products you should buy, which kind of services you would like. So when you talked about before about how our behavior is shaped and it's kind of designed by companies. And I thought, well, this could be done, and this is probably done in a very objective way, in a bottom-up way, or in a very purposeful way. I mean.
Mm-hmm.
So my question to you is like, what would you say about how our suggestion, which is also like studied by psychology, how we humans act on suggestions? So how companies or maybe individuals, but in governments, influence our behaviors by making these suggestions, which are based on surveillance.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now that question can be answered on many levels, of course. I mentioned one of the areas that in which surveillance is used is neurosciences. Neurosciences are very interested in many things, but that includes the activities of the brain when given certain kinds of stimuli. And that is one thing that, again, to go back to Meta, they are very, very interested in those kind of brain activities. Meta owns probably the largest neuroscience lab in the world, which gives you some idea of how those things develop. But so yeah, at that level, it can be explored in one way, but there are so many other levels and in other ways. And yes, in later, sessions of this course, we're going to be looking at those kinds of questions. So, two in particular. One, when we're talking about surveillance capitalism and how surveillance capitalism works and what its impact is, all those kinds of things, there we'll come to some kind of answer to that question. So I'm kind of assuming that you will come again after tonight. So that would be one. And the other is when we talk about the culture of surveillance. And that notion of our being involved and experiencing, as Dean Coelho just asked about, that we can talk about more in the session on culture of surveillance. And yeah, it sounds like it's one thing, the culture of surveillance. Of course, there are many cultures of surveillance. It's very interesting to me as a professor and researcher to see how my ideas get used by other people. And one of the books that came out recently that refers to my culture of surveillance book as being the sort of inspiration for their work is in Scandinavian countries. Another book that just came out last year is about the cultures of surveillance in China. Also really interesting. It's a wonderful book. But, that came out of, that they say, I mean, the authors say that they were inspired by the idea of culture of surveillance that I discussed. And so I have discovered so much more about the culture of surveillance from reading people who read me first and then went off and wrote their own study. So we'll bring that in for that session. So I'll try to answer better at that time. And if I don't, then tell me. Okay? You had a question.
Yes,
You have a question?
You want to answer now?
Sure,
Yes?
sure.
Okay, I would like to highlight the importance of the ubiquities that you said, because it's also the lack of transparency in this field. Also is the same problem in the field of artificial intelligence, and also highlight the importance to the consequence, not just individual, but social and collective consequences. And also in the field of law, in philosophy of law, we highlight this about fundamental rights, because many people are just focused on privacy or discrimination, but there is the potentiality to damage all fundamental rights. So I think this is important to focus in the collective and the social aspects also. And I'm thinking, what would be a way out of the situation about collecting our personal data to not just the use they say to us, but other kinds of use? Because we have legislation here. I don't know if in Canada that you have. So it's against law. We have the protection, the principles, finality, transparency, good faith. How could we be more prepared and have protection?
Well, another great question that we will be looking at, and in the years that I've been studying surveillance and trying to understand it, I've also been called upon by people to discuss in different contexts. After 9/11, for example, I was asked by the person who was setting up the new airport security system in Canada if a group of researchers would come together and talk with them about the best and most appropriate way of doing this. Privacy commissioner in Canada, like in the United States, the talk is about privacy. And there again, I've spent years in the company of privacy commissioners, both in Canada. We have a very what's the word? Decentralized system. So each province is responsible for major areas, and the federal government is only responsible for a certain number of issues. And so I've spent a lot of time with privacy commissioners from each of the provinces and also the federal department. So yeah, I've had a lot of experience of that. Of course, I am not I'm not an expert in those legal frameworks. It is true that I'm Professor Emeritus in a faculty of law, but I should tell you now, and I know the Dean is listening to me as well, I have no qualification at all in law. In the university, we often have smoke and mirrors, and this is a bit of smoke and mirrors. I'm a professor of something that I don't profess. But I was invited to be a professor with that faculty, and I agreed to it, for better or worse. And so I'm not a legal expert, and I already told my professor friend here that I was not a legal expert, but I am very interested in the process. And let me just say one thing about your question, Paula, and that is this. You use the word transparency. I think that transparency is hugely important. That is to say that those who are collecting data for surveillance purposes should be very clear about what they're doing, why they're doing it, and what uses they are making of those data. So I think from my studies and my experience with data protection people, data protection, that's Europe. So Europe uses the term data protection, the European Union. In many ways, I think it is superior to the way that we use it in the privacy commissions of Canada and in privacy law in the United States. I think the European Union has a much better, fuller, deeper, and meaningful grasp of contemporary surveillance. They still have a very long way to go, but I look to them as a model. I haven't even talked with my colleague about those differences, but I do think it is hugely important, and I don't want to underestimate the importance of that at all. But the one thing that I want to say about transparency is that, important though it is not sufficient. It's vital to the process, but it is not enough. So my very strongly held view is that transparency has a purpose itself, and that purpose, for which we try to be more transparent, is accountability. And in my view, the accountability is the superior thing to which transparency is answerable. We should be clear about what we are doing so that we can be held accountable for what we are doing. As I say, we haven't had this discussion yet, but I think that is hugely important. And that is one of the things that is so hugely missing in so many surveillance operations in the 21st century. It's accountability. It's being accountable for what the corporation, the government department, the police department, the security department, whatever it is. The accountability is critical. And yeah, I mean, if you're thinking about security and policing, but national security, not our last project, but, well, yeah, it was within the last large research project. We made a book about the ways in which the security services in Canada lack accountability. They're insufficiently accountable. And we got someone who was not a university professor to write the last chapter of the book. We asked someone who used to work for one of Canada's federal security agencies. And we got her to write the chapter discussing what we had said in the book. And she, as someone who used to work for one of these organizations, said that she agreed with almost everything we were saying. We were quite surprised. We thought she might be a bit more negative, but she said, yeah, that's right. The accountability is important. And she had realized, as someone who works in the agency, that that was true. I mean, also in 2013, 2014, we were doing a lot of research about Edward Snowden and the release of information about what the National Security Agency in the US does. And actually the students at my university in 2013 invited Edward Snowden to speak. And it was the students, it wasn't the professors. In fact, the university didn't like it. But the students invited him to come on a video link from Russia, which is, as you know, where he is in exile. And it was a really wonderful evening listening to him speak about his experiences. And the students asked me if I would chair the event and talk with Snowden about that. But, you know, his work is demanding accountability of the National Security Agency. And that's why he's in exile in Russia, because he's demanding accountability of that federal organization. Accountability is totally critical. And you might not agree with what Edward Snowden did. You might not think that he chose the best way, whatever. That's not the point that I'm making. The point that I'm making is he believes in accountability and the accountability of organizations. So I think that transparency is super important, but it's not as important as accountability. And we'll see as we go along why that is such an important question. Okay, any other questions just now, or shall we move along? And
Do you want to make a break?
do you want to make a break? Yeah, we could do.
Yes.
Sure.
5, 10 minutes.
Sure. Which? 5 or 10?
10 minutes.
I don't mind. I mean, I have a talk to give that is more, we're going to think about the earlier history of surveillance, long before the word surveillance ever existed. So that's what we're going to be talking about. And
Because we are a little bit, it's 7:10 now. What do you think? 10 minutes. 10 minutes, okay? Yes.
okay, 10
So we
minutes.
come back in 10 minutes?
Yep.
Okay.
And we will start again in 10 minutes time. So if you don't make it, we will begin. Okay. I think we said 10 minutes and 10 minutes has gone. So what we're going to look at in part 2 of our evening together, and by the way, if you do have any feedback, then I'd be very happy to hear, because I want it to be, this is for you, it's not for me. I want it to be as appropriate to what you would like as possible. So you can tell me, at the moment you can reach me at liondavid48@gmail. I've got a bit of trouble with my own university email account at the moment because I'm in the wrong country and blah, blah, blah. But you can reach me on my Gmail account if you want to tell me anything about, you know, how things are going for you in the lecture, and if you would like to tell me about specific things you want me to mention, and I can check that I shall say something that relates. But do feel free, because you know, I'm not going to have time to talk with all of you afterwards. And actually, we had a very long flight here not long ago, so I'm not going to stay a long time after the session this evening. I hope that's okay, but do be in touch with me if you want to. You are more than welcome. Okay, so the background to surveillance. We're talking now about surveillance in a world that did not have the word surveillance to describe what was happening. Okay? And this is, I'll tell you, this is the current topic of the book that I'm writing just now. I have a book contract to write a book about this pre-surveillance surveillance. And I'm very excited about the project, and I'm enjoying it. And you'll discover why I'm enjoying it so much. But yeah, you all know what the what's showing on the screen at the moment. It's the prison design, the diagram from Jeremy Bentham. It's the panopticon, and panopticon is often seen kind of as the beginning of surveillance, where what we talk about as the thing that was the first obvious sign of surveillance. And we do that mainly because Michel Foucault wrote about panopticon, and not necessarily because Jeremy Bentham wrote about panopticon, but he did. So what was the panopticon? It was an idea that is often attributed to Jeremy Bentham, who was an English social reformer and philosopher. And he was writing this design, making this design in the 1790s. So 1793 is when this came out. And he wanted to reform and reorganize prisons in England. He wanted to get rid of physical punishment, and he wanted to introduce a way of getting the prisoners to discipline themselves. That was what he wanted to do. He wanted them to think that they were being watched, so that they would modify their behavior and become, as Michel would say 2 centuries later, docile. The eye that watched the prisoners would not be available, not be visible to them, because in the diagram, the eye, as it were, of what Bentham called the inspector is right at the center of the hemisphere. And he had a way of obscuring the view of the watcher and maximizing the view of those who were the watched. Bentham knew that for hundreds of years, many centuries, people in England, and in fact all over Europe, had assumed routinely that an invisible eye had been watching them. That was the eye of God. That's the title of my book, Surveillance and the Eye of God. Bentham's plan for the panopticon, the writing that went with this diagram, quoted a text from the Bible about God's constant watching. If you know the contents of the Bible, it's Psalm 139. But Bentham promised that actually no watcher would ever be needed again. He wanted to automate the invisible eye, and he also hoped to secularize God's eye. Now, the eye of God is a very ancient idea. It takes different forms in different religions. It's not uncommon in other religions than Christianity, but of course it is very important within Christianity. It's been through many stages, how we understand the eye of God, which by definition is invisible, just as God is invisible. Michel Foucault famously noted this in his discussions of the panopticon. And in one discussion that was published later, long after the discussion took place, with another historian, Michel Perrault, he makes this profoundly telling observation. So Foucault, talking with his colleague, Michel Perrault, says this: "Yet it is Bentham who begins by relying on a single power, that central tower. As one reads him, one wonders who he is putting in the tower. Is it the eye of God? But God is hardly present in the text. Religion only plays a role of utility." Bentham was a utilitarian philosopher. He would use the phrase, the greatest happiness of the greatest number. So you get a sense of where he's coming from. But Foucault is reading Bentham rightly, I think, in knowing that he seems to have some sort of idea for the eye of God in his panopticon, but it only plays a utilitarian role, says Michel Foucault. Now, for my purposes in this research project that I'm doing, I'm very interested in in that little phrase from Foucault. Foucault sees Bentham's panopticon as being related to the eye of God, while simultaneously dismissing the idea that Bentham had anything more than a utilitarian sense of the eye. In other words, Foucault suggests that the shadow or the ghost of God's eye is present in the panopticon, but now in decidedly secular form. Which begs the question that intrigues me. What did the eye of God mean in those medieval times and earlier, for whom it was an everyday reality that informed their understanding of the law and indeed of the practice of everyday life? There's a Canadian philosopher called Charles Taylor, and he wrote a book in 2007 which is called I can't remember what the title of the book is. That's the trouble about being in your 70s. You forget things more. Charles Taylor, The Secular Age, that's the title. A Secular Age. It's about that thick. It takes more than 10 minutes to read. And in that book, he redefines the notion of secular. And he says it's not about modernity somehow eroding religion, as if that would be possible. But unfortunately, quite a few sociologists once thought that modernity would erode religion and it would disappear. It was more of a hope on their part than a reality. But he very carefully talks about the ways in which it's actually the conditions for belief that have changed. It was much easier to believe in God when everybody else was also assuming in everyday reality that God exists and is watching. Everybody believed it, and it was straightforward to believe. Today, so many changes in technologies and urbanization and industrialization make the conditions for belief more problematic. And other things too, the movement of different populations from one country to another. Brazil, like Canada, is an immigrant society. What is a Brazilian? What is a Canadian? I'm a Canadian citizen. I was born in Edinburgh, in Scotland. So, you know, who am I? Our children are British. Our grandchildren are Canadian. So, what do we do? So you see what I'm saying? It's an interesting question. So, what does that earlier I mean? The I of medieval times. How does it relate to contemporary ways that eye of God might be used as metaphors for today's surveillance? For example, if you look at Shoshana Zuboff's The Age of Surveillance Capitalism book, which is about that thick, also doesn't take 10 minutes. If you look in there, you find a very interesting discussion of Massachusetts Institute of Technology computer scientist who writes about the eye of God. The eye of God, of course, is his computing system that he's invented. But it's the eye of God. So the metaphor is still really important in the 21st century, but it's a metaphor that is drained of its earlier uses from medieval times. This is why I find it so interesting. Not only do we ask how these different eyes look, but also what lessons can be learned from the historical sociology of the eye of God. By historical sociology, I mean people's actual everyday lives in medieval Europe. How can we learn from the eye of God in their time that might relate to the ways in which surveillance has changed so much over the years? So that's my current project. And just like not being a legal scholar, I am not a medieval historian. But just like not being a legal scholar, it doesn't mean I can't learn from legal scholars. And I love learning from legal scholars. I can even tell you who my favorite legal scholar is. It's somebody called Frank Pasquale. And Frank Pasquale wrote a wonderful book about the Black Box Society. I think it's one of the best things written by a legal scholar. There's another legal scholar that I really like, and he's called Bernard Harcourt. And he wrote a book about desire. Can't remember the title, but I'm well off my notes, and that's why I'm losing track. So before we go on, let me comment on an obvious query. To discuss what happened in Europe might be construed as a Eurocentrism that ignores what happens in other parts of the world, including, of course, other religious conceptions of God's eye. However, I think it's important to note that a secularized God's eye, the doctrine of a secularized God's eye, traveled to other destinations than Europe. And we have to think about how ideas traveled and what sort of vessel they would travel with. And one of the most important vessels, I think, unfortunately, was slavery. Because the slave trade between Europe and the Americas and Africa already, you can see, has Europe in touch with the Americas and with Africa. And so the ideas, like the eye of God, traveled with them. And surveillance ideas traveled definitely across the Atlantic in a mode of what you might call racializing surveillance in relation to slavery. If you look at Simone Brown's book, which is called Dark Matters, and the subtitle is The Surveillance of Blackness. If you look at her book, then she talks about the movement of Bentham's ideas with the slave ships to Africa and the Americas. So, Eurocentric, well, maybe, but this Eurocentrism moved around the world. So I don't think that it is only, I'm working on this, I'm trying to understand it. But I think that it's important to say that the European influence was global, and that the kind of surveillance we experience today, I think, originates with these European trends. But you have to wait for the book. I haven't finished the research yet, and I'm working on it. So I want to push back the question of earlier eras. Oh no, first I wanted to show you the picture. Is this going the right way now? Ooh, we don't move very fast, do we? Let's try this one. Oh, there it is. Okay. So the 18th century British slave ship Brooks, that is depicted in the diagram here, carried 454 slaves, legally carried them under this Slave Act, and it regulated that law regulated transatlantic trade of slaves from Africa to American colonies. They were tagged or marked, sometimes with branding. They're horrible stories. And tagged or marked and numbered men and women. So in other words, the surveillance is already there, the identification practices, the pinpointing of which person this was, because of course they were going to be for sale in the Americas. So they're already under surveillance, and they carry their surveillance with them. They were packed tightly along the decking and on shelves. And although the diagram is obviously very unclear, you know what it's all about. They are literally packed together, and the slaves were frequently not only packed together, but sometimes interlocked with each other. They had to stay in the same position. No wonder so many died before they got to their destination. But anyway, the slave ships, I think, is one of the ways in which the eye of God was moving, or the secularized eye of God was moving. Jeremy Bentham is supposed to have invented the panopticon, and he did invent that prison diagram, but he actually got the idea from his brother Samuel. And yeah, I'm not going to spend time on his brother Samuel, but it wasn't Bentham actually who had the panopticon idea in the first place. But that was in the 1790s, as I say. 300 years earlier, a famous painting clearly depicted an eye of God that art historians see as predating and maybe inspiring the panoptic idea. There we go. Hieronymus Bosch made this painting of the 7 deadly sins. It's a kind of tabletop painting. It's very large, and you can see the shape of the table and also the roundness of the eye. And in the center, the pupil of the eye is a Christ figure, and the 7 sections each have a depiction of the deadly sin that is noted here. And so the idea is that the God's eye in the center is keeping watch over all these areas of human life where there might be some contravention of the law of God. Let's put it that way. So there you have Hieronymus Bosch. This painting is 1485. So I promised we were going back, and we are going back. We can take this story back to the 5th century. I'm not going to take you there this evening, but my story that I want to tell in the book goes to the 5th century. I don't think I'm going to have time to write another book, but I want to look at the earlier period too, but this is as far as I'm going. The figure in the middle is also known as the Man of Sorrows, which was a biblical prophetic name for Jesus. And the whole circularity of the eye can also be seen as the global reach of the eye of God. The art critics say that. And what God seems to see is the classified sins possible on planet Earth. Yeah. So in other words, the everyday life, which is round the edges, the everyday life in different dimensions is seen by God's gaze. I won't go into it this evening, but I've been discovering more about the work of Nicholas of Cusa, who was writing another generation before Hieronymus Bosch made this. He has a book called De Visione Dei, the seeing of God or the vision of God. And he discusses another painting, which is a self-portrait. And the portrait, in this case, to the viewer, that is changing completely by itself. Oh, you did it. Okay. Thank you. We don't need to look at this one, but it's fine. I don't mind. The eye in this one, that in the book by Nicholas of Cusa, appears to be looking at you from whichever angle you are looking at the painting. And the artist has deliberately tried to give that impression. You've come across such things. And of course, such things are also found in many churches, both in Russia, where this one is, and in many other places, including in Brazil, because I've been in church buildings in Brazil, and there may well be a figure, a Christ figure, who is looking out on the congregation, and that eye is on the congregation. The eye is everywhere. The eye is the eye of the all-seer. In the Cusa story, the De Visione Dei, the idea is that the all-seer, seeing the all-seer, evokes something in the person who is looking at that painting. And the idea, and this is a much, much older one, this goes back to the 7th century, Bede, sometimes called the Venerable Bede, an English monk. He wrote about the ways in which seeing the eye of God should be an encouragement for us to let that eye become personal to us. So we internalize the eye. And it becomes, in the words of Bede, a, excuse me, internus arbiter. So, in other words, an internal judge. So that's the idea. Now, those of you who have read Michel Foucault will know that that is exactly, well, not exactly, because Foucault obviously didn't know about that, but he wrote about something as if it was new. But actually, Bede had said this in the 5th century. And I find that very interesting too, because Foucault's ideas really do pick up on something that is very ancient, although I don't think that Foucault himself understood. I have to talk with some Foucault experts, just like I am talking now with medieval historians. I'm not pretending that I'm finding these things out, but I am finding some wonderful medieval historians who are helping me to understand, for my historical sociology, of surveillance before surveillance had a word. So I'm going to have to move on. Yeah. So just to go back to the Bosch painting that we had there a moment ago with the 7 deadly sins. A German art historian, Schmidt-Burkhardt, she suggests that there is an unceasing watchfulness deliberately embedded in this painting. Watchfulness over all. So it's both temporal and spatial. So the eye of God has that all-embracing temporality and all-embracing spatiality. So I have to rely on the knowledge of art historians to get these ideas, but I think that's really an interesting one too. However, Cusa's purpose, that's Nicholas of Cusa, was actually not just to dream up this idea, but to apply it to ordinary people in their everyday lives. And so he sent the painting of the person whose eye follows you everywhere to brothers in a monastery, the Benedictines of Tegernsee, so that their everyday awareness of being seen by God should provoke in them not primarily fear, 7 deadly sins and all that, but love. He wanted them to see that this God of the of unceasing watchfulness was primarily a loving God. And he was sending the painting to those monks as a kind of icon to help them remember that God's eye is on them. Rather like in the so-called Negro spiritual, his eye is on the sparrow. We'll return to that later. And many more things that we could say about this. The eye of God also appears in a triangle sometimes, so that it has a kind of Trinitarian, it's like the Trinity, and the eye is in the middle of the Trinity. So there again is the Christian dimension of the idea of the eye of God. And that's in the Baroque period, so in the 16th century and 17th century. And it's from them that you start to see the sorts of images that we have on the screen at the moment. And so it's true, of course, that the eye of God was a reminder of God's watchfulness. But what kind of watchfulness was intended. While some aspects of what we might call policing or checking up on 7 deadly sins, you could be forgiven for thinking that that's what that's all about. God, the divine police officer. You know, that's how you could read that painting. And no doubt that was there for some. But if you think about the agrarian and pastoral context of medieval Europe, it's much more likely, and I'm finding this in some of the research that I'm doing, it's much more likely that the person or the characteristics of the person who is watching is that of a shepherd. The shepherd who watches out for the sheep, the shepherd who watches over the sheep. And of course, that is also a very biblical metaphor. So it seems to me that the Middle Ages would be more likely to have the shepherd as the model of the eye watching over. And as I say, that is very clearly an image in the both the Old and New Testament of the Christian Bible. But the eye does not just appear in artistic forms, although it's very helpful historically to see the paintings because they are a great source of understanding the culture of the time, but it's elsewhere as well. In a book that came out in 2019, an American historian, medieval historian, Ben Saltzman, explores how belief in the eye of God had consequences for everyday life in a medieval monastery, for example, and also for those interpreting the meaning of the law for ordinary citizens. In an earlier period, again, this is now between the 5th and 11th centuries in England, but also most of Europe, it was assumed by those of Christian faith that God knew all human secrets, although God's secrets were unknowable by humans. And this belief in an all-seeing and thus all-knowing God gave structure and meaning to everyday life. It was simply taken for granted that God could see all that happened. Saltzman shows how the law codes from early medieval times named and assumed God as a constant witness in legal disputes. We have a carryover to that in the 21st century, that in some courts of law, for example, you put your hand on a Bible in order to show that you're telling the truth. Same kind of idea. You put your hand on the Bible to show that you are aware that God is watching and listening as you make your give your response in the courtroom. Then Amanda Power, one of the medieval historians that I'm learning from, she describes this world of medieval surveillance, which many medieval people had. The majority of the population accepted the simple statements of belief that they were given, and confessed something of their thoughts and actions to priests. Part of the story then was, to quote her, they lived within a system of full surveillance, which was expected and desired, and also sometimes deeply feared. Fear promoted both good behavior and repentance for bad behavior. And not only the priests, but also civil authorities might use similar methods. This is Christendom, after all. But at the same time, suggests the same historian, Amanda Power, there was also a sense that, quote, the lost happiness of humanity consisted not in the harsh travails of private existence, but of just this, living naked and innocent within the absolute love of an omniscient watcher. So that's her conclusion from her studies. And there's much more to explore here. Did Bentham and Foucault claim too much about these ideas of an unseen eye being new? Well, Ben Saltzman, the guy who wrote the book that I just quoted from, insists that, yes, both Bentham and Foucault failed to recognize the earlier medieval precursors. Bentham's claim to have produced something, quote, hitherto without example, and Foucault's argument that the 17th centuries saw the invention of this new form of discipline, Saltzman says, miss the crucial theological precedent of divine omniscience that came from divine seeing. This shouldn't detract from the fact that each of these commentators still did have some limited understanding of the eye of God. Both Bentham and Foucault did, I believe. But Saltzman says they're missing the crucial theological significance, which, as you remember from what I was saying about Charles Taylor's work on A Secular Age, it's to do with the changing conditions of belief. The belief in the eye of God was an everyday life experience for whole swathes of European populations. As I follow my research to understand the prehistory of surveillance, I see more clearly that we cannot afford to ignore the religious origins of modern surveillance in Europe. They help us to understand the changes that occurred within surveillance's historical development. And perhaps they show that a different kind of surveillance is possible, one that doesn't lead simply to the forms of intrusion, coercion, and social inequality, I haven't started to talk about that yet, but it'll come, that are often feared in today's surveillance. Maybe there are clues about how to humanize surveillance from a much earlier era. And frankly, that's what I'm hoping in this research project. So, let me draw things to a close by just telling you what I think are three themes that I want you to look out for in the following lectures that come after tonight. One is that surveillance is always an ambivalent practice. There's no way we can talk about surveillance being always good or always bad. It's always ambivalent, and there will be different levels of the desirability or the effectiveness or whatever it is of surveillance in one context or another, but it's always going to be ambivalent. I think surveillance, and you might be surprised to hear this, but I think that surveillance still has the possibility of potential for human flourishing. Much can be discovered about today's world and how today's world works by scrutinizing data that is produced by humans' presence and activities. But at the same time, surveillance practices are always uncertain and may frequently not be adequately portraying persons or populations fairly or appropriately. So surveillance, out of this point, we have to say, inevitably has ethics and politics. If it's ambivalent, we have to work out what is an appropriate way of thinking about it, of judging it appropriately, and secondly, of what to do about what we find out about surveillance. So it's ambivalent. Two, the persons, and I'm thinking about human beings primarily here. Surveillance can be, for example, about bird populations and their movement globally. It's a really important area, and I applaud those who are following that, because questions of climate change are profoundly important, obviously, but they are also expressed in the flights and places of living creatures like birds. So bird surveillance is really significant. I'm primarily concerned, however, about human surveillance, that is to say, involving human populations. So persons deserve to be respected as such. And I'm saying an awful lot there because I'm speaking against the scientific and rational reduction of human beings to mere data points within surveillance systems. I find that horrifying, and I find it a constant theme of what is going on in surveillance today. So I want surveillance to be humanized, to be done in a way that is appropriate to the human beings who are its subjects and, unfortunately, objects. And persons deserve to be treated and respected as such, and that has given rise over the years to questions about privacy, data protection, and so on. But I also want to stress, equally importantly, if not more importantly in the 21st century, that claims for data justice and data and algorithmic justice are also tremendously important. We're talking about fundamental human rights here, and it goes beyond privacy. Privacy is a concept which is so compromised with the figure of some autonomous, liberal individual that has certain benefits for having changed law appropriately, but I find it a hopelessly inadequate way of conceiving what a human being is. I want to argue that the human being is far fuller than it can ever be encompassed by a liberal individual notion of humanness. So it's ambivalent practice. Persons should be respected as such, even more so in an era when AI is becoming hugely important. And I'm going to talk about the impacts of AI within surveillance systems during the series. And then the third thing that will run through the talks, as groups in the population are consequentially classified using surveillance, we must focus on processes of what I call social sorting to grasp how surveillance works. So it comes back to that first question that I was asked over here. I talk a lot about social sorting because social sorting is a critical way in which contemporary surveillance operates, and actually it turns out it has very often been the way that surveillance works. But today it's so obvious that surveillance operates by means of dividing populations into categories and treating those categories differently. And so if you add AI to an already flawed system, you are going to exaggerate what was bad about that system in the first place. And so it's really important for us to think in terms of new and developing concepts like data justice, algorithmic justice, and so on. The techniques and technologies of surveillance are always sensitive. Their origins and their basic impulses have to be transparent. Surveillance makes us visible in particular ways, which is then how we are represented to other people and other organizations, and how we are represented is how we are treated by those other organizations, those other agencies. That's why it's so important for us to delve into this question. To seek privacy and data justice and other things like that is to find fair and appropriate ways of revealing, characterizing, and dealing with people. So those themes run through what we're going to be doing over the next couple of weeks. I hope you'll come back for more sessions after session 1. And it looks like you could bring your friends too, but that's up to you. But I've said what I'm going to say tonight, and I hope that's helpful. I told you a little bit about my new project that I'm very excited about, and I am very wrapped up in it at the moment, and it is thrilling. We were discussing earlier on what a privilege it is to be a professor. You know, they let you stay on after you did your PhD, and you can go on being a student until you're in your mid-70s like me. It's an incredible privilege, and I am very grateful for it and grateful for the opportunity to share some of the ideas that I work on in my research, because that's another privilege, to be able to share the ideas with other people who are sufficiently interested to listen. So thank you for your listening. Thank you for attending, and we'll look forward to more. I think we're up to time, aren't we? Yes, we're already over time. Sorry
We'll have the
about that.
questions for tomorrow.
Apologies. Yeah, keep your questions, and if you have lots of questions, we can always start the session with a few questions tomorrow. That's fine. But I'm sorry for going over. Here are a couple of pieces. I discovered that there's I didn't know this. There's a Portuguese language dubbing of a little talk that I gave. I actually gave it in the library of the university where I work, and it's freely available there. And also, I don't think I noted this elsewhere, but the last big project that we did in our Surveillance Studies Center at Queen's has a public report. It's in English and French. If you find the French easier than the English, then it's in French too. It's called Beyond Big Data Surveillance, Freedom and Fairness. So a project that I led, and we wanted the findings to be available to everyone. I mean, Canadians obviously, but I think the report is quite a good one for suggesting ways in which we think beyond big data surveillance and aim for freedom and fairness rather than privacy or other ideas like that. Not rather than, I mean, privacy and, if you like. Anyway, that's available online too. So
Thank you so much, Professor.
I've gone on even longer now.
So thank you all, and we see each other tomorrow. I hope you bring more friends of you. And thank you all. Thank you, Professor.